Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. The Institute offers NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals who are looking for advanced training in complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The NeuroAffective Relational Model is a cutting-edge, innovative approach for resolving CPTSD, addressing attachment, developmental, relational, and intergenerational trauma. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. Today's episode is another conversation between Dick Schwartz and Larry Heller. If you haven't already listened to our first episode with Dick Schwartz, it's called Internal Family Systems and NARM, and it was released in September of 2020, and I highly encourage you to listen to that and listen to this one. This was a really particularly deep conversation that was quite meaningful to me, and I just can't wait to share it with you all. But let me just tell you a little bit more about Dick Schwartz. He began his career as a family therapist and an academic at the University of Illinois at Chicago. There he discovered that family therapy alone did not achieve full symptom relief, and in asking patients why, he learned that they were plagued by what they called parts. These patients became his teachers, as they described how their parts formed networks of interrelationship that resembled the families he had been working with. He also found that as they focused on, and thereby separated from their parts, they would shift into a state characterized by qualities like curiosity, calm, confidence, and compassion. He called that inner essence the self, and was amazed to find it even in severely diagnosed and traumatized patients. From these explorations, the internal family systems model was born in the early 1980s. So please enjoy our lovely conversation with Larry Heller and Dick Schwartz. Well, hello to Dick Schwartz and Larry Heller once again on Transforming Trauma.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Dick.
Hi, Larry.
It's nice to have you back. And actually, I'm going to really let Larry take the lead today. And normally we orient at the beginning of this podcast to what is it that we want listeners to get out of the interview today. So Larry, why don't you take it away from here?
Well, I enjoyed our conversation last time, and I thought that in the time that we had, we did what we could, but I was hoping to go to some of the deeper structure of both of our works and see how much common ground or what differences there might be. And also maybe for me, clearly the deeper structure does have a spiritual component, as it seemed, you and I talked about that. It seems that that's true for you too. I know in NARM, I've built that understanding into a clinical application, which I'll talk about in the course of our time together. Something that I read that you wrote about, there's a part of us that never gets damaged or never gets injured, no matter what the trauma, which is very similar to the first phrase that I begin all the NARM trainings with, something that is close to that. Also, too, some of the practical things, because like I'm curious, you talked about firefighters and other kinds of things like that, how that fits into the bigger picture of how you see humans, personality, the human condition, all those interesting things.
Yeah, I actually just am finishing a book on this topic of IFS and spirituality, and in it, try to lay it out as a big picture. A big picture sort of shift in paradigm about what is human nature. So it sounds like that's similar to NARM.
Yeah, I believe it is, and I'm curious to hear the details, and then I'll share with you some of the details of my work too.
So it's come a long way in terms of the spirituality. I come from a family of physician researchers and came into this work as a kind of scientific atheist. And it was only through touching in with clients over and over, through working with their traumas and finding that there is this essence inside that I've come to call the self with a capital S, that regardless of how horrible their childhoods have been, can't be damaged and has all these seaward qualities. It was like, as I said, the same person would pop out as parts open space for it. And yeah, so it had a lot of similarities across people as well. And a lot of the qualities were just the right qualities to allow them to heal themselves. And so as people would access that, and it did seem like the same person almost across people. First of all, I couldn't hold the attachment theory's belief that to have any of that, you had to have had a certain kind of good enough parenting at a certain critical period in your childhood. because many of my clients had been tortured on a daily basis when they were young. So there was no way you could explain that being there if you had to posit that they got it from external, from a relationship. And that's the way I was thinking about it first.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, that I had to let go of that one. And then clients actually began having more spiritual experiences in my office. And at first I was trying to get tenure at the Department of Psychiatry in the University of Illinois. So I would really discourage any of that. And then my curiosity got the best of me and I just started to explore it more. And so over many, many years, kicking and screaming, it got to where I just couldn't deny that there was a spiritual element to all this. And largely in what I'm calling the self, but also as I got to know parts, there was a lot of parallels because now they've evolved to the way I think of them as sacred inner beings who are trying their best to keep us safe and are forced into roles they don't like by the traumas. And once released from those roles, almost like a spell has been cast out, they'll transform into who they're naturally designed to be, which is always quite valuable. And they also, if you talk to them individually, which I've done because I've worked with clients who were diagnosed DID or multiple personality disorder, where you have to talk to one part for 10 sessions maybe times. They'll talk about their parts and they'll talk about their self, and they would start to do the work just as one personality. And I've actually gone one layer lower than that, and it's the same. And so there was some kind of beautiful symmetry to how nested doll phenomena or fractal phenomena of it also seemed quite spiritual to me.
Okay. Well, my kind of spiritual development was, I was already I don't know how many years under my belt of being a psychotherapist and, using more or less a couple of different traditions. And I did this work, which I actually wouldn't recommend these days, but it was a deep breathing work because in NARM, we don't impose changes of state on people. We work with or create the conditions where these deeper qualities, as you're calling them, and capacities, as I sometimes call them, or states, are able to emerge. But going back to that, I had what I realized later were spiritual experiences on my own that I didn't know how to incorporate into my work. They just seemed kind of amazing things where I had these experiences like that everything was perfect, just exactly the way it was, for example. I would sometimes get I've been a runner for a long time. Sometimes I get those in long distance runs. And of course, people would say that's just the endorphins kicking in, but that's a mechanistic, scientific, or, explanation for, I think, a much deeper phenomenon. But then I did this deep breathing work specifically focused on the fourth chakra. I would have characterized myself as an agnostic before that. And I had an experience in this one session that changed my life, really, in the sense that I had the direct experience of being like this point of light in this massive web of lights that was the entire universe, and that every molecule of the universe was made of love. And it was ultimately benevolent, despite what we see on the incredible suffering on other levels, but that this was basically a loving and benevolent universe, and I was just a part of that. And it opened things up, and then I did a couple of different spiritual traditions, and in a serious way, I had made a serious commitment to it. And then out of that, and also, and then I was seeing the limitations of the models of therapy that I had been exposed to and integrated, and I was also seeing some of the limitations of the spiritual work that I was doing. Out of that came and developed really over time this understanding of NARM, but it's truly, even if I'm working with somebody who has no interest in spiritual experiences, it's kind of irrelevant in a sense, is that deep level of understanding informs my interventions all the time. And I'm sure, getting to know you a little bit, that you probably experience something similar. But when I'm working with people, I'm in a very quiet place in myself. And there's an openness and a curiosity, and very present in my body and in the moment. And ultimately, I talk about really most human symptoms are the result of disconnection. And that's disconnection from what you would call the self with the capital S, disconnection from other people, and disconnection from true source, the universe that is the source of everything. So in NARM, the orientation is working with this connection-disconnection process, never pushing for connection, knowing that since that's our nature anyway, the way that the 4 pillars of NARM are set out is that we just explore the connection-disconnection process and what are the obstacles that are getting in the way of the deeper connection that all of us seek and long for, whether we know it or not. Some people consciously know it, but I think it's there in all of us as human beings. And so that deep structure then has informed both the structure of the NARM therapy and the clinical interventions kind of in general.
Yeah, so all of that's very similar and born of similar experiences. So when I first encountered through this process of getting parts of Step Back self in clients, and there's an energetic quality to it too. So people would have this vibrating energy going through their bodies. And that was kind of familiar to me because coming out of college, I did TM, Transcendental Meditation, just as an anxiety kind of control thing. I wasn't into the spirituality of it at all, but it was effective in doing that. And through the mantra, I would have these sort of unity experiences like you're describing. And I would feel that vibrating, warm energy make your hands tingle and so on. And so as my clients started to show up that way, I started to think maybe they're accessing that same thing. And then down the road, I experimented some with psychedelics and could leave and enter that total non-dual place that was very blissful to not have boundaries. So it evolved to where I started thinking, maybe this is like in quantum physics, where light particle, a photon, can be both a particle and a wave, and that there is this wave state of self that you enter when you meditate or when you do the psychedelics that you entered, where you can see it's all about love. And there's that at this level down here, everybody's feeling isolated, but that's a big mistake. And then when you leave that wave state and enter the particle state, so you have boundaries and you feel separate, but it's the same self that has just shifted state. And that's why it can't be damaged. And that's why when you access that self, even though it's in its particle state, you have a sense of connection to that bigger state. So connectedness is one of the qualities of self. And you have a sense of more connection to the self of other people and to the self of these parts. So connectedness is one of those big C-word qualities that we talk about, especially in the spiritual realm, and that a lot of what we're here to do is to connect the dots. And my model and your model, you talked about the obstacles to connection I call mine a constraint releasing approach. So like you don't have to build up the muscle of compassion, because if you just get the constraints to your natural compassion to relax, then you have plenty of compassion. So it's sort of become clear that we're here to do that. We're here to learn these lessons, and that this is a very difficult school. So
this world, I believe you're talking about.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly the case. So, again, we are resonating, in terms of our models. There is a common ground. And I'd also see compassion and other kinds of what I would call heart states as our nature. And we've disconnected from our heart and from these deeper capacities and this deeper nature out of adapting to environmental failure in various kinds of ways in our upbringing and so on. And the original title of my Healing Developmental Trauma book was Connection, Our Deepest Desire and Greatest Fear. Mm-hmm. Because our deepest desire is another way of saying it's our deep nature, and we want to know that on some level. But then we have all of these learned protective adaptive mechanisms that we've developed which I think is probably related to some of your parts and, some of those protective parts, and that make us afraid of connection at the same time. So then it's working with that dynamic of our deep desire and what are the fears about, because in the NARM model, the fears are always childhood based. And one important piece of that in the NARM clinical model is that so much of what needs to be unlearned is what was learned in order to try and protect the attachment relationship. And that children will give up parts of themselves, will foreclose access and connection to parts of themselves, particularly the deep, vulnerable, open, heartful parts of themselves, when there is environmental failure in order to protect the attachment relationship. Like I say regularly in my trainings, from a child's perspective, they cannot experience themselves as a good person in a bad situation. So much then of what we take to be our identity is really just an internalization, particularly the painful parts of our identity, is an internalization that we carry forward, an internalization of the original environmental failure or failures, usually, that we internalize and carry forward. And those represent the obstacles that we explore that get in the way of that access to what is deep and true and real and connected in us.
Yeah, again, very similar, but different language. So what you're talking about in terms of the things you had to disown and push away to maintain the attachment relationship, I call exiled parts. They're parts of you that either triggered your parent or weren't in the rules of the family. And so you have to lock them up inside in some kind of a container. And people will describe it as an inner basement or abyss or cabin. And they also accrue, and this is similar to what you were saying, what I call burdens, which are extreme beliefs and emotions that came into you from those interactions or from some trauma and attach to these parts and then drive their operation almost like a virus, like the coronavirus. From my point of view, a big mistake the field has made has been to assume that parts are what they seem to be. So the panic is just a panic attack, or the critic is just a critical internalized parental voice, or this sense of worthlessness is just a belief. And what I find is that those beliefs and emotions aren't native to you. They came into you from these experiences and attached to the parts, and they can be released. Once the part feels it's safe to do that, we literally can send these out of the system and leave the part. And then the part transforms into its naturally valuable state. And then when you can unburden like that, they come out of exile and you have access to all of their talents that you didn't have access to before. And also these burdens that were such obstacles in terms of connection, both externally and internally, are no longer there. So you're freed up much more in that endeavor to connect. So yeah, it's just a translation of what you're saying. And a lot of it is these exiles are frozen in time in really tough times during childhood. And so there's also what we call retrieval aspect of going back, witnessing what happened, getting them out of where they're stuck back there. It's often a child image, and bringing it into the present, at which point they are willing to unburden.
One element, I talk about these old identifications, these develop, in particular, I talk about shame-based identifications and pride-based counter-identifications. And part of what I've come to understand in the work that I, have done with people and in my own work on myself is that all of these old identifications, which are not who we are, but who we've come to take ourselves to be, are actually held in the body in the form of tension and or collapse. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've had this experience that when you're working with somebody and there's a resolution of something important, almost consistently, people will say, I feel more spacious, or I feel more room, or more space.
Lighter. Yeah.
Yeah, lighter, and their vision gets clearer. They often have an expansion of the visual field and so on. For me, that's part of that psychobiological dimension, that as you connect to what's most authentic, there's an increase of connection and flow and all of the access to these various elements of our nature, like compassion and love and acceptance, and all of that becomes available to us. And it's mediated through bodily experience, at least on one level. Bodily, and when I say bodily, I mean also energetically, bodily and energetically. So.
Yeah. So to translate that, as you unburden, as your parts unburden and they transform, these burdens are very dense energy. So they take up a lot of space in your body.
That's true.
And once they're out, it's much more spacious.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm calling yourself has much more access to your body.
Mm-hmm.
Because often trauma can push self out of the body. And that's why you have these out-of-body witnessing yourself getting hurt experiences. So people start to embody more and more, in which case they start to feel those, what we call the 8 C's, which you just mentioned several of. So they naturally feel much more compassion. They naturally feel more connected. Naturally, you mentioned clarity. They see things both internally and externally much more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
They're much more curious and far less afraid to look. And they have that courage. That's another C word. And they also feel confident and creative in how they operate. So those are, I don't know if I got them all, but those are the called the 8 C's, which when I was encountering self, and it seemed like the same person in so many people, I started to catalog the qualities. And oddly enough, they all began with the letter C. So yeah, again, on the same page.
Yeah, we are. And one of the slides that I use is called The Distortions of the Life Force. And it pretty much is consistent with what you just described when I talk about that we're all drawing from this deep source, this core energy or life force, and different traditions give it different names. And then I describe how that connection to the life force gets distorted as we adapt to trauma. Mm-hmm. And I do make this important distinction, and I'm guessing you do too, but you can tell me, is that it's really the adaptations to trauma rather than the trauma itself that drives the symptoms that people experience. And we can take those adaptations, the large category of adaptations, various ways of disconnecting, or as you talk about it, pushing, foreclosing things, putting them in exile. It's the fact that we are now in exile and that we long to be back in the garden, that creates the symptoms that we experience.
Yeah, just as we long to connect with what you might call the big self, our parts long to connect with ourself. It's all parallel that way. And the burdens they carry disconnect and keep them disconnected. And the burdens that our body carries, because our parts have these burdens, keep us disconnected from the big self. And as I was saying, keep what I'm calling self, the capital S, a little bit disembodied. So a lot of it is, we're here to learn these lessons. A lesson plan is contained in burdens that we collect as we go through life, and the lesson becomes how to unburden and reconnect.
Yeah. I'm just swimming in all of it. I do have some questions, though, that have come up as you two were talking. And I also just want to note, as we're really swimming in the depth of this discussion, I am feeling a spiritual energy, and I'm just really kind of basking in that glow. And I'm just so appreciative of being here. I've spoken a lot with Larry about spirituality on the podcast, and it's something that's very important to me. And it's really absent from a therapist's education, is being able to incorporate spirituality and what it means for people. And, as we talk about these terms like life force and heartfulness, these are not terms that were taught in school. And I'd love to know from both of you, I guess, what needs to change? What would you like to see happen? How should we be incorporating this?
Yeah, I don't know that school is where people should learn about this. And schools have to maintain a certain distance from it, I think, just to stay credible. So a lot in the culture would have to change first, and especially the culture in psychotherapy. And so it is for students to come to trainings like Larry's and mine, where we aren't so afraid of the consequences of talking this way, where they can pick up more of it.
Yeah, I think you and I both talked about what's so popular in our field are these manualized and protocolized so-called approaches to psychotherapy, which often really implicitly ignore or deny that there's any depth to who we are. I mean, if you think about the original behaviorists, there was no depth. There was just behavior. There was just that level of experience. And in NARM, I go to great lengths to point out that behavior is just this superficial manifestation, and particularly kinds of disordered behaviors are just a reflection of the internal conflicts and distorted strategies and various kinds of things that people have. And that behavior is only one marker in NARM of what's important. I mean, it's not unimportant, obviously, particularly when people are being self-destructive, but that's my way of saying that I agree that I don't think this can be taught so much in schools, in universities. We're lucky to have anything other than CBT being taught in many universities these days, which is, from my perspective, a tragedy. But seriously, I know I'll offend some people out there, but, and I agree with Dick that it's something that people really have to get in a different context. I just don't see it happening in a university setting.
The more I did this work, the more intrigued I became by the parallels between the way people relate inside and outside. And this relates to spirituality too, because too many spiritual traditions see the ego as the enemy, or see certain emotions as okay, and then other emotions, like the Dalai Lama talks that way, lots of people talk, and will demonize some emotions and then try to, pull in the antidotes to those emotions. And the more I explored and found that there weren't any bad parts, that even what are thought of as evil or really nasty parts carried these burdens that weren't who they were, and secret history of how they got locked into these roles and could be released from all that, and they would transform and be good. And so then it became, how do we get people to first get curious and then ultimately love all these different parts of them, even the ones that they thought were dangerous or scary, and gave them psychiatric symptoms. So for me, I could go over the DSM and I could go through each category and tell you parts of non-pathologized, very uplifting kind of definition of what parts are involved in each of those symptoms. And so the parallel then is, if you can relate in a loving way to all parts of you, then you can relate in a loving way to all people who resemble the parts of you that you used to be afraid of or hate. And so for me, it isn't just the inner work. I train a lot of social activists now, and it's bringing that parallel to the outside world. Yeah.
I agree that, of course, social activism is needed and necessary, and it can also become a way that people politicize some of their own internal dynamics. And so we've always got to be mindful of what it is, what place in us we're coming from when we're doing, the needed social action work that is there. Because if we're not clear about where that is, at least to some degree, then it colors the social action work that we do.
That's exactly what I'm doing with social activists. So I'll have them think of their cause and then notice the parts that come up to try and do the work. Because so often they're coming from this very righteous place that only puts people off, and other parts. And so then we'll find that part and see why it's so driven and help it. We heal the exile that drives it, and then get it to be more in the backseat and let the person do their social activism from this open-hearted self place.
Yeah, makes sense. And I also wanted to relate to the comment that you made about certain spiritual traditions, because I have the exact same experience, and it troubles me. And I know sometimes when I say these things, I step on the toes of some spiritual adherents. But even you mentioned the Dalai Lama, but particularly Thich Nhat Hanh, the way he's demonized anger.
What did he say about it? Because my experience is he talked about anger that you needed to hold it like a baby or something like that.
Well, what I remember, I haven't read him for a while, but what really struck me at the time that I read it is that he said something like, any angry thought is dangerous.
Really?
Yeah. Now, that was some years ago. I'll double check to make sure I'm accurate about that, but that has come to my mind. But whether he said it or not, there are individuals who hold that idea. Mm-hmm. And from my perspective, that's a dangerous idea because, again, using your language, it creates more exiled parts.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's what it does.
So I make the point that there are no destructive emotions, there are destructive behaviors. Mm-hmm. And so that as we integrate the powerful energies of these emotions and understand what they're trying to communicate, mm-hmm. then they transform, as you described. They become just aliveness and expansion and heartfulness and joyfulness and being more increasingly present to yourself and others. So for me, it's a very important distinction. And I do think, and then the same comment you made about the ego, to do this splitting, to make the ego the enemy and the ego bad, for me, it doesn't show a deep understanding that the ego is just this word that we've used to represent certain kinds of aspects of ourselves, and to demonize them, it creates a spiritual conflict in people, because then they do ego reduction work and all of this kinds of things in the different spiritual traditions. And for me, it seems so misguided.
And it also leads to what's been called spiritual bypassing. So
I use the same expression.
Yeah, I think John Wellwood was the first to come up with that. And I can't tell you how many meditators I've worked with where as we start to head toward their exiles, they suddenly, I feel great. I just feel easy and calm and safe. And I'll say, all right, find that meditating part and get it to step out, because it's just trying to keep you away from where we're trying to go. And I'm speaking from personal experience, because that's how I used TM for years. And a lot of that is just because the emotions, the parts that we're talking about are seen as the Maya, or they pull you down, or they get in the way of your purity. And it's just a big mistake.
And it creates more splitting. Mm-hmm. and more disavowal of important elements. So again, we're agreeing about that. And it's actually nice for me to hear a fellow teacher kind of with a similar point of view, because sometimes I have in my various trainings, it's for psychotherapists, but many of them have different spiritual backgrounds, and sometimes it can be challenging. Usually they get it eventually to see that I'm not attacking any particular tradition, but there are certain ideas that are common to a number of traditions that I think are counterproductive. I'm not taking a judgmental stance, but I don't think that they're useful. And like you said, some people use meditation to get more present in themselves, and other people use meditation to actually further dissociate. Right. So,
and I'm not against meditation. In fact, mindfulness meditation, for example, can be thought of as separating from your parts, your thoughts and emotions, and observe them. And if you get that kind of unblended separation, you will immediately access more self, because it's, like I said, right there beneath the surface. And then your parts, while you meditate and you stay in the present, and you feel all this energy, they're seeing, I guess we don't have to run the show. There is this other guy there. So it becomes an exercise in producing more trust of them in your leadership, as long as they're not being demonized by the spiritual tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we're on a similar page here. One of the things that I mentioned to people is that we don't ever want to judge or criticize or demonize parts of ourselves that helped us to survive. Mm-hmm. The strategies that they developed have outlived their usefulness, and now they are creating difficulties for us, but we want to look with understanding and compassion at that whole dynamic. When you hold those processes from this place of compassion, that's one of the supports for those elements to transform. And then a certain kind of understanding about what the strategies have been trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious on a procedural level. I'll share a kind of a piece with NARM in terms of and how it fits with this bigger picture that we're talking about. And then you can maybe clarify for me a little bit more about like asking parts to get out of the way. Or in NARM, just procedurally, I tend to denominalize things. So people come in and they have this tendency to talk about the inner critic, or they talk about the inner child, or they talk about the superego or the ego, and they talk about other things like burnout. And I always like to create the atmosphere where they can start seeing those as processes and not discrete things, that they don't reify those elements. Because they're, from my perspective, we can call it an inner critic, but it's really just a process that's been there to protect us. And so it supports holding all of the underlying fluidity and not making it more of a thing than it already is.
This might be a place where we differ, because while people will come in and say there's this inner critic, my take is it's not an inner critic, as I was saying earlier. It's not a bundle of internalized critical voices, which is the way the field has seen it. It's a part who got forced into being it's like a parentified child who is stuck with all this responsibility and doesn't know what to do to get you to behave other than to yell at you. And usually if people can get curious and open to it and ask some questions, it'll reveal that. But it's still an entity. It's not a process in the way you're describing. It's a little inner personality that you can interact with. And a lot of people will see actually an image of, and the image will change as it steps out of the critic role. And it isn't, again, it's not me nominalizing them. I'm not creating this in them. I'm just saying the process would be, if you wanted to work on your critic, I would just say, okay, focus on it, find it in your body. And you could usually find it, most people find it in their head. And just stay focused on it and tell me how you feel toward it. And in answering that question, you're telling me how much of yourself is present, because if you hate it, that would be another part that hates it. It wouldn't be self, because self is those 8 C's. If you were afraid of it, that would be still another part, because it's not one of those C words. If you were curious about it, then I'd say, okay, and especially if you had a certain tone of voice. In my head, I'm saying, okay, now we have the critical mass of self. We can start to get to know it. And I would say, okay, ask that critic what it wants you to know about itself inside, and wait for an answer to come from that place in your body. Don't think of the answer. And people would get an answer, and we would learn how it's trying to protect. And then I'd have them honor it for its service, like you might the military. And then there's a lot more places you go with it. But again, it's an entity that's inside of somebody that you can interact with. And just like you would an external entity. And for me, it's because it's real. It's not a metaphor. It's not a constructing. It's, for me, the way the mind is designed, and that we have all these subminds in there. For me, the big advantage of thinking yourself that way is that as you go through your day, you can interact with them and check on them and remind them to open space and let you lead your life, rather than them feeling like they've got to take over all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that may be an important procedural difference between the two systems. The kind of the bigger picture in NARM is that this inner critic comes from a combination of places. So one is the traditional understanding in the field, which is introjected criticism from the parents. And there is that element of what some people call the inner critic. The other part of it from the NARM perspective is that in the distortion of the life force, we're hardwired, like an infant is hardwired when they're uncomfortable or sick or in pain, to protest. And that even before words, that protest is a communication to the environment. And when that protest goes unmet, then it can wrap up into anger. And that can be threatening for the child from two different perspectives. One is that there can be retaliation from the environment if there's anger communicated towards the parents. But even when that's not the case internally, it's threatening for the child to feel anger at the parents upon whom they're 100% dependent and with whom they have a love relationship. They can't hold that they can love and be angry at the same person. So there's this tendency to split. And for me, that's the beginning of shame, and that's the beginning of self-rejection. That's the beginning of self-hatred. And it's all of that is viewing the world through the lens of the child. I call that the child consciousness. I don't talk about the inner child, but this child consciousness that we carry that forward. Obviously, we can carry it our whole lives and see the world through that lens forever. But as we do the work, then this disavowed anger, when in a process that we talk about as emotional completion, the person is able to feel what the real message of the anger is. Basically, it's something is like, I deserve to have these basic psychobiological needs met. And that shifts the relationship to the self. So instead of when they begin to experience what the anger is trying to communicate to the environment, it also communicates to the self this feeling, I deserve to have these parts of me attended to. And that, for me, that's a radical shift for many people, and the self-hatreds and the shame that people live with tends to diminish radically as that energy, the energy of that anger, instead of being acted out. I don't do pillow beating or any of that old kinds of stuff. But as that energy gets integrated, there's more flow, there's more connection to the heart, there's an integrated sense of self. And I think probably that capital S self that you use, and I'm not trying to, there's not a competition here. It's just interesting for me to see how we've evolved different ways of trying to address what we see pretty similarly as kind of the underlying themes that human beings struggle with.
Yeah. And, as I worked with people with their critics or their anger, and we ask these questions and stay curious and follow where they take us into the past a lot of the time and find the exiles they're protecting. We get very similar answers in terms of where the source, the root of the feelings, but it sounds like it's quite a different process to get there.
Yeah, I think that's why I talked about it as procedural, even though it seems like the deep structure is similar, but that the procedures are somewhat different. And maybe at some point, if we continue our conversations, I'd love to see a session that you do to see how this actually looks and feels. And I'd be happy, of course, to share a session with you if you're interested. Because that's, again, for me, would be intriguing, because clearly we're tuned into some very similar things, but then addressing it maybe in, well, as we're saying, some different ways anyway, and some.
I'd be interested in that, sure.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. Do either of you have any final thoughts or questions for one another?
I think, Dick, you and I have been around in this field for pretty close to a similar amount of time. It's just, it's fun for me to be sharing on this level with a very experienced teacher as well, and you've got your own model and see the commonalities and maybe some of the procedural differences. So for me, it's a very enjoyable experience.
Yeah, me as well. And I think Sarah might have commented on this, but it isn't that often that two leaders don't have their egos not to demonize the ego, but don't have their protectors doing battle to say who's better. So,
well, I think that both of us share the common view of curiosity as being such an important piece. Yeah. And that's where I'm coming from here. I'm really curious about your approach and understanding, the common ground and whatever differences that we have. So curiosity is always a joyful path.
And for me as well, and it's felt that way. So this, from my language, this would be a self-to-self conversation.
Yeah. That's how it feels to me too.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dick.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And I know we got a lot of really wonderful feedback from the first time we had you on the podcast. And like I said before, I'm just really feeling a deep resonance with what you all shared. And I'm certain that the audience will feel the same as well. So thank you both for being able to show up with your capital S selves today.
Okay.
Welcome. And I really did enjoy it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. You can connect with us in many ways. On Instagram, find us under @the NARM Training Institute, on Twitter @NARM Training, and Facebook @NARM Training as well. The NARM Training Institute also offers the Inner Circle, an online self-paced learning program intended for anyone who is interested in joining an international online community focused on healing complex trauma. You can find more information about these trauma-informed learning programs in addition to other resources on the website, www.narmtraining.com. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.